Welcome to the World Affairs Council Ambassador Circle Luncheon. We have a great honor of having the Ambassador of Sweden here with us today and his delegation. And again, thank you all for coming. We're looking forward to a great year. Enjoyed having a very successful 2014.
I'm John Lasseter, a member of the World Affairs Council Board, and it's my distinct honor and pleasure to introduce our speaker today. With us is Ambassador Bjorn Lyrvall. He's a career Foreign Service officer who initially presented his credentials as Sweden's ambassador to the United States in September of 2013. This was his first posting as the chief of mission. He was born in Hofors, Sweden in 1960, and this is, I think, an interesting point to understand the connection that he had early age during his high school years. He spent a year as exchange student in a town called New Wilmington, Pennsylvania. And I say that, Mr. Ambassador, because we have Old Wilmington about 4 hours east of here. He graduated from Stockholm University with a degree in political science, Eastern European affairs, and Russian, and you'll see how well he took those studies to bear because his life plan after that literally followed it to the T. He started working in Sweden's Ministry of Foreign Affairs in 1983 or 85. He was posted to the Soviet Union early in his career, serving as vice consul in Leningrad and making Sweden's trade counsel on Soviet issues. He was also stationed as ambassador in Moscow and in London. In the mid to late 1980s, he spent much of his time on the Balkans, a point of broad concern for everyone around the world today. From 1995 to 1997, he was special advisor in Sweden's Minister for Foreign Affairs in his role as the EU negotiator and international high representative in Bosnia and Herzegovina. In 1989, he was named United Nations Special Envoy to the Balkans. He went to the European Union in Brussels in 2002, first as Sweden's delegate in the enlargement negotiations, and then in 2003 as Sweden's ambassador to the EU Political and Security Committee, remaining in that post till 2007. He returned to Stockholm to serve as Director General for Political Affairs in the Foreign Ministry. He remained in that post until being sent to Washington 2 years ago. He and his wife, Madeline, who also works in Sweden's Foreign Ministry, have 3 children. I think you said they're 11, 12, and 14? 15. So he's the parent of emerging teenagers when we all will be thinking about you in the days to come. Please join me in a warm Charlotte welcome to Ambassador Lyrvall.
Thank you, John, and you can imagine how fun it is to be here when you have your kids back in DC and you can sort of relax meeting you all people this afternoon. Thanks to LJ for inviting me. I'm very honored. It was quite impressive, as a matter of fact. I think you were one of the first to actually send a letter when I was appointed ambassador and arrived in Washington, DC last year, inviting me to speak to the World Affairs Council in Charlotte, and obviously it's very much an honor for me to be here today with all of you. I'd like to thank Nederman for their sponsorship as well. I'd like to say a few words about what preoccupies my government when it comes to some of the international affairs challenges that we are facing today. But I'd like to start by assuring you that the relationship between Sweden and North Carolina are really in very good shape. So even if we have major challenges internationally, our relationship is very, very positive. Looking at the companies very much active in this state, Electrolux, Atlas Copco, Husqvarna, Volvo Trucks, and Nederman, and others, this is a relatively small country, about 10 million people who have some major companies investing in this part of the United States, essentially creating about 15,000 jobs here. And in addition to that, there is also a community of Swedish Americans, about 55,000 of you, who are very much great ambassadors for my country in this state. So it's a good starting point to talk about the positive relationship between Sweden and North Carolina. I think there's more to come over the years to come. And also, before starting to address some of the real challenges that we are facing in international politics today and what we believe are on the top of our agenda, let me just put this in context. What has happened over the past 20 and 25 years, I think, needs to be mentioned at a time when you wish to address some of the major concerns that we are facing. Actually, the last quarter of the century has been one of the very best that mankind has seen. We've seen the end of the Cold War, the dismantlement of the Soviet Union, the reunification of Germany, the enlargement of both the European Union and NATO. We have seen conflicts that are claiming more than 1,000 lives, actually declining by more than 50%, from about 15 in the early 1990s to 7 in 2013. And the number of free countries in the world has increased since 1990 from 37 to 45%, according to Freedom House. And the child mortality rate has almost halved since 1990. 6 million fewer children died in 2012 in comparison to 1990. Poverty rates have been halved between 1990 and 2010. But there is still about 1.2 billion people living in extreme poverty. Gender equality improving worldwide, and women are assuming more power and also more power in national parliaments. We see science and technology developing, new discoveries, new interconnections, and within 5 years, nearly a three-quarter of the world's population will have access to mobile broadband connections. And we are moving towards a hyper-connected world where the internet not only links individuals and things together, but also will soon create contacts and connections between virtually everyone and everything. So it's a world of immense possibilities. That is the context. But, of course, all challenges remain, and we also have a number of new challenges emerging. In Eastern Europe these days, we see a revisionist Russia invading, occupying, and illegally annexing parts of southern Ukraine, and fighting a proxy war in eastern Ukraine. In the East Asian region, we see a more assertive China. In Africa, immediately south of the Sahara, we see new areas of terrorism threatening the region as well as all of us. In Mesopotamia and in the Levant, we see a region engulfed by new sectarian divisions and fundamental threats that really challenge the previous existing order of states. And let me take the Arab Spring as a starting point. Well, optimism a few years ago came with the ousting of 4 dictators in Tunisia, Egypt, Yemen, and Libya. This was the greatest challenge to authoritarian rule since the collapse of the Soviet bloc. But, as we all know, the Arab Spring has gone into reverse, and we see sectarian strife spreading. Fighting and devastation result in huge waves of refugees making their way to Europe, and not least to Sweden. We also see direct challenges to our own security, and most important of all, to the fundamental values in our free and open societies. And today, there is actually a striking risk that significant parts of the Levant and of Mesopotamia will be plunged into the Islamic world's equivalent of Christianity's 30 years war. This underlines, I would say, the need for a development in which the values of the open society and the principle of an open economy are stronger in the region than they are today. And these battles will be won only by using our values, not our arms. We need to engage with this region in helping it address its political, economic, and demographic challenges. Because it is in dysfunctional societies like Iraq and Syria, with a lack of democracy and political inclusiveness, that things like the Islamic states of the Levant, ISIL or ISIS or Daesh or what you want to call it, was allowed to take root. And we must do two things in parallel. We must tackle the immediate costs in the crisis and work at the same time for a political solution. And to tackle this immediate crisis, well, my country, together with many other countries, are investing quite a lot in humanitarian assistance to those affected. Sweden contributed approximately $200 million since 2011. And this was important, not only to help alleviate the suffering of people in these areas, but also, I would say, to deal with challenges and threats to our own national security. Sweden is these days taking 55,000 Syrian refugees. Could be up to 100,000 within a year. That would be about 1% of the Swedish population coming within 1 year to my country. The country in Europe that takes the most number of refugees of any country within the European Union. And obviously this is a strain on society, and it's something that underlines the importance of trying to tackle these crises at their roots. The UN Security Council and various UN bodies, I would say, play very important roles. There has been 3 resolutions in the fight against ISIL, but we also see a UN Security Council that is being blocked on Syria because of Russia. We see the multilateral cooperation on ISIL as a necessary thing to do and to engage in, but the UN Security Council is actually not really providing an avenue these days. And Sweden, like some 60 other countries, are therefore engaging in the US-led coalition in the fight against ISIL. And without a solution to the wider conflict in Syria, it would be impossible to successfully combat ISIL. In Iraq, a new inclusive government is a step in the right direction, but it's not enough. We need a strategy, obviously, to counter ISIL and other forms of violent extremism. Education, creating opportunities, battling poverty, promoting other values, inclusiveness, all this must be part of a concerted effort to counter the narratives are also increasingly important. Let me then turn to the south of the crisis in North Africa and in the Levant, south of Mali, to the outbreak of Ebola in West Africa. The spread of Ebola demonstrates something different. It also demonstrates that weak institutions and governance in a rather distant part of the world can have global effects. And it points at the need to support fragile states, from peace enforcement, peacekeeping, to peace building, and to peace sustaining. And once again, globalization through transportation, media, different kinds of connections means that we are not immune, even if in another part of the world something like this happens. We have seen cases of Ebola in the US. We have seen scares of Ebola in my country, Sweden. Both countries have responded forcefully and in partnership. Sweden, once again, has provided a total of around a number of about 72 million US dollars so far, making us one of the top 3 or 4 bilateral donors. Humanitarian support, technical expertise, and different other support to medical treatments, isolation measures, logistics, protecting children against violence and exploitation, training of health workers, and dissemination of information supporting healthcare at Ebola clinics. These are the kind of things we can do. And after enormous efforts over the past few months, and they are certainly by far not over yet, the virus is now no longer chasing people. It's the people that are chasing the virus. Now, you could say that the Ebola outbreak was not intentional, not man-made, but it demonstrates what might happen if biological weapons were to be used. And from that point of view, it's worthwhile also looking at another major threat and challenge to us these days: proliferation and use of weapons of mass destruction. Whether they are used intentionally or by accident, they are clearly a major threat to international peace and stability. Let's take a look at North Korea, for example. How do we deal with a state that disregards the rules and that doesn't care about the international community? What kind of lever, what kind of strategy are we using for them? We see a need for a broad coalition, restrictive measures, and dialogue. Sweden established an embassy in the DPRK in the 50s, and are trying to, one step after another, to engage in some kind of dialogue. We are also serving there as the protective power for the United States, who is not in a position to have diplomatic relations with North Korea. We see the negotiations on Iran and the nuclear program, discussions with them going on, extending to June 2015. And I think it's very positive that talks are ongoing and that the nuclear activity is halted during these talks. We see a deal that needs to be effective and verifiable. We need to see that all the doubts about Iran's intentions must be resolved. My new government, which is in place since about 2 months, is trying to raise the profile of my country, also when it comes to nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation. Of course, we share the goal of a nuclear-free world with many others, including the United States, as a matter of fact, but we have no illusions about the complexity of this issue, but it should be a long-term, objective, at least, for our work. And one priority is to make sure that nuclear weapons and material do not fall into the wrong hands. We need to work closely, not least with the United States, to deal with nuclear security globally and in country-specific cases as well, like we did with Ukraine some 20 years back. And we are particularly concerned about the situation with non-state actors. And we also, in this particular case, have a concern with Russia. Nuclear weapons are being more and more important in the national or even nationalist rhetoric of Russia. Russia is in violation of international arms control treaties like the INF, and they are leaving some of the important multilateral formats like the Nuclear Security Summit. The effects of the use of weapons of mass destruction appear instantly and would have devastating effects. Effects of climate change is not as instant but as devastating long term. And that is a risk that a rise in temperature will have serious consequences even for life on Earth. Already witnessing global diversity crisis, we see some of the largest species extinctions in history. And also here there is a need for concerted efforts. And we have next year an upcoming climate summit in Paris where some crucial decisions will have to be taken for our generation. Climate change is a global security threat, and I think it's worthwhile mentioning it in a context like this one when you're enumerating some of the challenges we are facing, because it's time to take responsibility. Many countries are working hard on this. Once again, my country has tried to be active. We have reduced our emissions by about 25%, while our GDP has increased by about 60% since 1990. And that proves, in our view, that it's possible to counter climate change and prosper at the same time. And investing in a better environment creates jobs and prospects for the future. In Sweden's immediate neighborhood, we're also traditionally proud of, at least over the past 20, 30 years, we've been proud of having an area where we have been living in peace and prosperity. Even there, we're now seeing a downwards spiral and a turn to the worse. And once again, as I've been mentioning a couple of times, Russian action in Ukraine have actually been in blatant violation of international law and principles governing the international system as we know it. And we're also concerned that these particular responses, the intentions of the Russian leadership when it comes to keeping Ukraine from joining NATO or for integrating further into the European Union, something that the majority of the people of the country wishes, that is not enough. The idea is to draw new dividing lines in Europe between those states within the Russian sphere of interest and the others. There are certain effects or attempts to try to rectify the outcome of the Cold War and, as a matter of fact, to demolish the European security architecture. Russia has emerged as a revisionist power, violating and questioning the very foundations of the European order of peace and stability, which was actually built on principles that were also agreed with Russia in the 90s. Think about it. If we allow countries, big or small, to conduct a policy of smash and grab, what would happen to stability in Europe or security in the world? And add to that the violations we are now facing, Russian violations of territorial integrity of the Nordic and Baltic countries, events in Estonia with the abduction on Estonian territory of a police officer fairly recently, Russian fighter jets violating Swedish airspace, aggressive naval behavior against Finnish research vessels, and other examples of this kind. It's sad to say that after decades, when too many people took peace for granted, it's now the power of arms that is dictating the policies in my immediate European neighborhood. And, of course, challenges in Sweden's neighborhood are much more serious than we have seen them for a very long time. Challenges that we cannot face alone. We have to be, as a relatively small country, building security with others. The Nordics, the Baltic countries, the European Union with NATO, and through transatlantic cooperation. And let me first say one word about the Nordic cooperation. The Nordic-Baltic cooperation is something that we are looking for across the board. It increases our security. It builds on a long-term historical experience of cooperation between the Nordic countries. We are ready to engage very much in both security and defense cooperation with these countries. It's a preferred option by my government. Secondly, Europeans can never really pivot to Asia. We rather fear that turmoil in the Middle East will pivot into our societies through instability, through refugees, foreign fighters, and we are conscious of a revisionist Russia that challenges the very core of our societies. So therefore, we are also seeking to build a stronger European Union common foreign security policy, to continue to develop new instruments like within the areas of aid and trade, building institutions, capacity, and policies that could actually bring peace, stability, and development to our neighbors and our neighbors' neighbors, for that matter. Third, my new government is clear on that Sweden will not join NATO under the present circumstances, but will be continuing to be a very active partner with the alliance and work very closely with it. And as a matter of fact, we have participated in all NATO missions over the past decades and will continue to do so, in my view. Fourth, we need a strong and reformed United Nations, able to solve tasks and to take on the challenges of the 21st century. We need a UN that is effective, efficient, transparent, and functional. And we are ready to contribute to this. Well, we are a major donor to the UN system, and we have a candidacy to be a member of the Security Council for 2017-18. UN in the sum is the sum of member states, and UN being unable to react in Syria and Russia somehow at the same time tells you something about the limits of the organization, but we still need to do what we can to improve it. Fifth, for this very reason, the inability of the UN to actually have the impact that we would wish it to have, we also need to see an ever closer relationship between Europe and the United States. Stronger transatlantic bonds. I think there are very few challenges that can be actually met unless we work even closer across the Atlantic. Europe and the United States needs to deal with various conflicts together. We need to deal with the issues that I mentioned on Ebola, ISIL, Russia, climate change, poverty, and we can actually achieve quite major results when we work together. Sanctions on Russia is one example. And when our shared values are being undermined, questioned or disregarded, we need to stand even more united than ever. I think there is a need for an even stronger strategy on how we can keep US engaged in Europe and in Northern Europe in particular. The ongoing negotiations on an European-American free trade agreement is obviously something that would benefit both the US and the European Union member states if it were to be comprehensive. But it's also something that I think would set the standards for world trade between the two largest trading blocs, the EU and the US. We have the power to do so and to have an impact also when it comes to regulations that also the Chinese and others would have to take into account. And then finally, Sweden and the United States, where I started. Here we have an excellent relationship, a relationship that I'm certainly here to try to develop and deepen even further. Going way back in history, last year we celebrated 375 years since the first Swedish settlers arrived at the shores of the Delaware River to set up the first Swedish colony, the first and only and short-lived Swedish colony in the United States, called New Sweden. And we also celebrated last year 230 years since Sweden, as the first country outside of the Revolutionary War, recognized the independence of the United States and signed a treaty. It was signed by Ben Franklin and our envoy, Gustav Philipp Kreutz, on a treaty on amity and commerce. And this old trade treaty is still a very strong basis for our current relationship that has brought so much positive to our transatlantic cooperation. Sweden today being arguably the largest investor per capita in the United States, the 12th largest all in all, which is not so bad for a country of 10 million people. Well, ladies and gentlemen, sometimes it feels as though we are back in the power struggles and the balancing acts and geopolitical thrusts of the 19th century, with the fear that one day this might even take us back to 1914. But in other respects, we are living in the middle of new issues of the 21st century, with entirely new demands for our policies, for our cooperation, and for our partnerships. So it's a world of immense possibilities. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador. And as we typically do at our World Affairs Council events, we kind of go into a question and answer period here where we have the opportunity for students as well as members of the World Affairs Council, those who have come today, to ask the ambassador pertinent international questions. So we have, I believe, a microphone. No microphone today? All right. We'll be able to, please, when you ask your question of the ambassador, please speak clearly and loudly so that everybody in the room can hear your question. And you must stand up. I'm being coached very carefully here. So make sure you stand up so that we can see you. And I would like to start a question, if I may. Since you are familiar and you've lived here in the United States, could you kind of compare and contrast with us the U.S. education system, since we have two schools here today, with that in Sweden and how you do your upper education as well, with state support versus just private support of your universities and school system?
Well, I can tell you, my kids, they believe that they have much more homework here than they had back in Sweden. Well, I mean, school in Sweden essentially is funded through the you pay your taxes, you send your kids to school. I mean, you get an opportunity to do your university and college education as well for free or on
State supported.
State supported, yeah. So that's maybe I would say a major difference. I think at the same time we do have some pretty good higher education, but I would not be honest with you if I wouldn't tell you that we have also had some difficulties in our primary schooling system over the past year developing. We've had some pretty negative or bad results in some of the polling and some of the surveys made of our schooling system. So the new government coming in now is stressing very much the importance of raising the quality of education on the sort of primary level up until including the high school level, in order to try to get us back in pair with some of the other European countries, because we have lost a lot of the quality that we used to have some 20 years back, I would say. Yeah.
Now, questions from the audience. Mike, you have a question, please?
Yes, Mr. Ambassador, thank you very much for visiting with us. Three quick questions about immigration and refugees. And thank you on behalf of all the countries in the world for accepting the refugees, and that's what you do. The questions are, the attitude that the Swedish people have towards this issue, it's a difficult one, and as well as the attitude, the way that you assimilate refugees and immigrants, I think are unique in the EU, maybe in the world. Could you share some of your thoughts about that? And, you know, this issue periodically comes up as a item of debate here in the U.S. Any impressions, suggestions that you have for us in that debate?
Immigration.
Well, I would say that it's generally I would say that the Swedish people are generous when it comes to immigration. I think we have benefited tremendously from consecutive waves of immigrants coming from different hotspots and troubled spots in the world. We took approximately 100,000 refugees from the wars in the Balkans in the 90s. Now that we are receiving a very, very large number, as I mentioned, from the wars in Syria. Still want to remember that Europe overall receives less than 1% of the world's refugees. So it's not as if we're talking about the sort of major numbers here, but we do believe that we should take our share. I think there is a debate developing in my country right now that we should be looking for an even more balanced distribution of receiving the refugees in the European Union, because as it currently stands, some countries are taking a very large number, others are not taking all that many at all. Sweden is, as I mentioned, the country that takes the highest number, and this is, although these people overall are contributing to the development society, diversity of society, it's still a strain on Swedish society, which also was proven by the concerns expressed in the very latest elections, when a anti-immigration party actually did better than any other parties in the elections, and raised to become the third largest party, now holding the balance in a way in parliament as well. So if this will be, the established political parties have actually expressed that they are not going to compromise with this xenophobic anti-immigration party. But if this development of the concerns that are being expressed through the ballot box in this way will be having some kind of effect on the policy, on the open immigration policy, remains to be seen. We don't see any signs of that as of today. But I mean, the overall view, I would still say, yes, measured immigration enriches the country. It gives you cultural diversity. Sweden now, I think I mentioned, have about 2% of its population from Iraq. 1% is coming from Iran. It's not the general stereotypes that you might have of Sweden aren't really correct anymore. It's a very diverse society these days, and that enriches us tremendously. When it comes to the debate here, I think I should refrain from commenting on that.
Good political answer.
You know, you have a high poverty, high rates of poverty. Does some of that tie in with some of the refugees and the immigration?
Well, it's a pretty developed social security network in Sweden, so I wouldn't really talk about people being left on the streets, or, I mean, you have a highly developed system in receiving and taking care also of people who are going through difficult paths in their lives. So it's, I don't know exactly what sort of your question would be there, but I think it is a system that I think is basically designed to try to keep to take care even of the sort of less advantaged people in society. Yeah.
And I wanted to know why, because I know a majority of European countries are part of NATO, but why isn't Sweden?
Well, that's a very good question. I mean, there is, as I mentioned, we are a country that cooperates extremely closely with the alliance, participates in various missions. Historically, though, Sweden has had a policy, we don't talk about that anymore, but a policy of neutrality. We've not been members of military alliances, and this is still something that lingers as part of sort of the national history. There are lots of people who are looking at the period of sort of being a country being able to stay out of wars. We have not been in a war since 1809, as something that you could credit to the fact that we have been a neutral country, as it's said. World has moved on. I mean, we are now obviously in a situation where we need to create security together with others, and there is a debate in the Swedish media and also amongst experts on whether this would be a time with the increasing threats you see from our eastern neighbor to actually take the step towards a membership of NATO. That has not yet materialized, because I think you still have a majority of people somehow a little bit behind the discussion on the expert level. So those who are talking about the favorable, what you can actually gain from a NATO membership, don't really get the kind of resonance in the broader groups in society. And in the absence of some kind of educational discussion on what would actually need to be done, how we should look at our security policy, there is no real political consensus on taking a step towards joining a military alliance. So we will continue to work as a good partner of NATO instead. Okay, thank you.
Okay, other questions? David, do you have a quick question?
Absolutely. Thank you. With respect to Russia, do you see, how do you see this conflict developing? Do you see a crystallization of a new Cold War with fairly rigid spheres of influence, with countries like Ukraine being unable to exercise self-determination essentially because they are effectively in the sphere of influence of Russia? How do you see this sort of developing over the next few years?
Yeah, I mean, I think we are all very concerned. I mean, you see across the board in the political debate in Sweden, we are concerned with what has been a much more aggressive stance by the Russian leadership than we ever expected, really. And it's still hard, really, to determine what are the final objectives of the ongoing activities that you see from President Putin with regard to Ukraine. I think it's clear, however, that he would like to, as you say, neutralize Ukraine from its intentions or wishes to join the European Union, or at least be a close partner of the European Union, certainly to make sure that Ukraine will not be able to join the NATO alliance. How far he would go, I don't think that he necessarily would have known that when he started. I think he has been looking upon what's going on in Europe as far as the sort of economical development there, the political integration, as Europe being in a stage of transformation and weakness. I think that he's been looking at the United States as well as not entirely determined on what to do in order to deal with Putin under these present circumstances, and he's trying to exploit what are the limits. He will go on until we will find a way of addressing and getting responding to him in an adequate way. What we have done as far as sanctions, I think, have been the right thing to do. Perhaps we should have been tougher earlier on in order to state a very clear example of what we can accept and not accept. That has been very hard to agree within the European Union, where different member states have had very, very different kind of allegiances with Russia or dependencies on Russia when it comes not least to energy. Sweden being one of the few countries that has absolutely no energy dependency on Russia whatsoever. Others are 100% dependent on Russia. So it's been hard to coordinate a tough position there because, well, at the end of the day, who will deliver your gas for the winter? So it's but having been through that debate and with all these different dependencies, I think we have done fairly well anyway. But not perhaps we have not been able to give the kind of response that would have actually stopped Putin earlier on. So I think we will have to try, and this is my government's view and my previous government's view as well, to continue to argue on the EU level and on the transatlantic discussion with the United States to continue to push for a tougher response, which would actually maybe set a clear tone to Putin and understand that time has come to stop this expansion, that otherwise I think he will be perpetually continuing to engage in until he's certainly he will continue to work on other countries in his immediate neighborhood, like Georgia and Moldova and some other weaker states in this area. So it's a very troubling development and something that we try to spend a lot of time on dealing with, but it also takes all of the EU and the US to do this together.
Yeah, I think we have time for one more question.
Would you describe the campaign for nuclear disarmament as being very bureaucratic along the lines of being very complex?
I wouldn't say, I mean, there are lots of people who have as an ulterior or long-term sort of dream that you would see a nuclear-free world, but I wouldn't say that this is something that we are expecting to happen overnight or during our lifetime. It's more of a and you see some. I mean, this debate about a complete nuclear disarmament belongs to the past. I would say you saw more of real campaigns in this respect some decades back than you see today. Now we are looking at practical measures that could actually deal with the proliferation issues on how to make sure that you will not, that the nuclear weapons will not end up in the wrong hands. They are intended to look at what countries and try to stop the proliferation of nuclear weapons to new countries like Iran and others. So this is what we are engaged in more than anything else. I wouldn't really be able to comment very much on sort of the disarmament campaigns that you refer to. Yeah.
Okay, I want to thank everybody for coming here today, and Mr. Ambassador, on behalf of the World Affairs Council of Charlotte, thank you for being here. We thank you on behalf of our membership as well as the schools that attend. Thank you for providing us your views and insights
Thank you very
on
much.
the world as we have it today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.